Yesterday, President Biden said that the data shows that overwhelming majority of Americans agree with my proposal. And there's no surprise given that 76% of American adults have already gotten at least one shot. Is it true that an overwhelming number of Americans like his vaccine mandate? Well, the latest Axios Ipsos coronavirus poll said that showed that 60% of Americans support the federal government implementing these two rules. But a Trafalgar Group poll found opposition amongst 60% of the public. The question was asked, do you believe President Biden has the constitutional authority to force private businesses to require vaccine mandates for employees? And it was just under 59% said no. Just under 30% said yes. Do you believe President Biden's national vaccine mandate sets a precedent that could be abused by future presidents on other issues? 55% say yes. Again, just under 30% say no. Do you support efforts of state governors to oppose Biden's nationwide vaccine mandates on private businesses? 46% strongly support, another 10% generally support. So that's essentially 56% of the public that supports the governors who oppose the mandate, while about 40% strongly or generally oppose the efforts by governors to push back against the Biden administration. There's some polling data, of course, shots in time for what polling data is worth, but it does not suggest, as President Biden has suggested, that an overwhelming majority of Americans are supportive of these vaccine mandates. But of course, as Christians, polling data is not the thing that primarily drives the way we think about issues. And for us, we have to think about whether or not this is biblical or not. Is the way we are thinking consistent with biblical truth? And helping me to unpack that question today is once again David Closson, who's the director of the Center for Biblical Worldview at Family Research Council. David, welcome back.
Hey, great to be back with you, Joseph.
Well, we're glad to have you. This is a critical question. First, there's a lot of ways I want to go with this. But first, I just want to ask, does the Bible forbid people from getting vaccinated?
It does not, Joseph. And I think that's a really important way to start the conversation because there is no chapter and verse that we can point to in the Old or New Testament, I think in good conscience, to say that the Bible would prohibit us from getting a vaccine. In fact, there's Christians who point to verses about caring for their neighbor that say that kind of that's why they've gone in that direction. So I don't think there's anything that prohibits us from getting a vaccine. So that the conversation is not necessarily about vaccines. It's specifically about being forced to get a vaccine, about a vaccine mandate.
Well, that is certainly one of the questions here about mandates, and I want to tease the point that you raised there a little bit further. We are commanded to love our neighbor. Does that mean, as many have argued, that we should get vaccinated because that is a way we show love to our neighbors?
And that's the decision and the conclusion that a lot of even my own Christian friends and neighbors have come to, that they think that Scripture, and it is true, the spirit and the posture of the Bible is to love our neighbor. That's the second great commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. However, Joseph, and so I think that's the logic that some of our fellow Christian brothers and sisters have found convincing. However, there's other Christians who would have maybe a different conclusion. They would say that actually getting a vaccine right now might make me complicit with abortion. Therefore, their conscience, kind of that center of moral right and wrong, is telling them that they probably shouldn't get a vaccine. And David, so I think that's a really significant part of the conversation too.
I want to jump in right there, and I want you to explain that argument a little bit, because for some people it may not be obvious what the connection between a vaccine and abortion is. So why would somebody have an objection to the vaccine on the basis of their objection to abortion?
Yeah, no, it's an important question. So according to the Charlotte Lozier Institute, which is one of the pro-life research groups here in Washington, D.C., fetal cell lines, these are older fetal cell lines that are used for research, but fetal cell lines were used in the development and production of the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. Now, when it comes to the Pfizer and the Moderna COVID-19 vaccines, fetal cell lines were used in the testing, not necessarily in the development and production, but they were used in the testing, the lab testing of those vaccines. So what a lot of Christians, some are arguing, Joseph, is that even a remote complicity with abortion is something that they don't feel comfortable with.
And that, I know, is an argument that's persuasive for a lot of people. The challenge for that, I mean, if you go back to things that are sinful, essentially all human knowledge can be connected to some kind of sin, right? And so I know that there are other people who say, yes, abortion is bad and we shouldn't have learned this that way. But the fact that we know it now does not mean it's inappropriate to apply that knowledge in other ways. That's another argument, but that's deep in the weeds of science, and frankly, one that I'm not qualified for, and I don't know that you are as well. And we'll have to bring somebody on at some point to tease out the ethics of that question. But I want to also address this argument that I've heard a lot. And as I was trying to explore this, when I have deep theological questions, I did what I think everybody does, and they went to Facebook. I went to Facebook, right? I go to Facebook and I ask my friends, what do you think? And kind of crowdsource this question. But this is really an argument that I think I've heard a lot of places. And it essentially goes that Christians should obey the law unless the law is asking you to do something that is unbiblical. And when the law is asking you to do something unbiblical, you must not obey the law. But until that point, you must obey the law. Is that the right way to think about this?
I think it's a great place to start, Joseph. And so obviously as Christians, our highest authority is God. And so when you get to the book of Acts, you know, the governing authorities tell the apostles to quit preaching. And what is their response? We must obey God rather than man. And so ultimately our primary authority is God. But government is something that is good. Romans 13 says that the governing authorities are ordained by God. What are they ordained to do? They are ordained to promote good and to restrain evil. So I think, Joseph, the posture that Christians should have generally is that when the government tells us to do something, so long as it does not violate a clear biblical moral commandment, that we should go along with what the government says. I think that's the posture generally that Christians should have when you look at a passage like Romans 13.
And that is an argument that I have made myself. Now, I want to go one step further with you and test the limits of this, because whenever we establish principles, we want to find out where that will lead us. Right. And are there absurd conclusions? Is there a limiting principle that needs to be in effect? And when we propose the standard that we must obey the law unless it is asking us to do something that is unbiblical. What if, I don't know if you know, Mad King Ludwig in Germany is kind of the turn of the 20th century. He built a bunch of castles that were random in Germany, but he was mad because he actually did apparently have some mental issues, and he built a Neuschwanstein Castle in southern Germany, which is really beautiful. And actually the Disneyland castle is based on Neuschwanstein Castle, but it's put on this hill because it had no actually military purpose. It's just interesting to look at. But he was kind of insane. And what if Mad King Ludwig came up with a law at his time, or other insane politicians, monarchs, right, who said, you must walk on your hands, or you must wear socks to bed at night? Neither of these orders would violate any biblical principle. Does that mean that Christians would be obligated to do something silly like always wear socks to bed at night because their monarch governmental authority had some mental issues and decided that was something he wanted to order people to do?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment. And, so again, we start with the principle that we're not allowed to do anything that disobeys God. The government does have its limits. Jesus was asked a question about taxes, and what was his response? Give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, the things that are God to God. And I think maybe a helpful way to kind of address the theoretical question you're getting at, Joseph, is what is the rightful role of government? And I think, Abraham Kuyper, a Dutch theologian and politician, offers us some help here with his whole doctrine of sphere sovereignty. So what Kuyper argued is that kind of life is divided into these autonomous, distinct jurisdictions, such as the state, the family, the church. And he would say the state has a special responsibility. It's empowered with limited oversight responsibility to do what? Well, to do what Romans 13 says, to promote good and to restrain evil. So something arbitrary like, a mayor or a governor telling us all to wear pink hats on Friday, while it doesn't seem to serve any purpose, it might not be unbiblical. Is it really furthering, the primary purpose of government to restrain evil and promote good? And I would think something arbitrary like that probably would not be furthering the purpose of government. Now, that doesn't mean that I wouldn't go along with it, even but it doesn't seem to be why God ordained government.
And the question for us is: are we morally obligated to obey the authority with respect to a particular law, or whether once they have exceeded their God-ordained authority, once they are operating outside the sphere that God has entrusted to government, then they are operating illegally in a sense. Now, I do think it's a different question in the United States. And I want to bring in a story we talked about a couple of weeks ago with John MacArthur and his church and the legal action that he had against the state of California, where he refused to close and not hold services when he was told to close and not hold services. There were a number of Christians who said that you should because the law said that. Well, once they sued, the courts actually vindicated the church and said it was the government, not the church, that was violating the law. So in a democratic republic like ours, we don't just listen to what the government says and automatically obey, do we?
No, and I think that's applicable, Joseph, to this whole conversation about COVID mandates, mandating these vaccines. Because you're right, when a government goes beyond its prescribed limits, it begins acting unjustly. It begins acting illegitimacy, and so it therefore loses its legitimacy. And so in this country, the law of the land is the Constitution. So if a mayor, a governor, or even a president steps outside of the authority that's been delegated to him by the Constitution, Christians are not required to obey him. The situation with John MacArthur and other pastors around this country, I think, is very analogous to what happened in the book of Acts, when the apostles were told not to preach about the gospel, not to preach about the resurrection of Jesus, and they said, we have to obey God rather than man. Then as Christians who are called to gather and called to worship, no government can step in like many governors and mayors try to do over the last year and a half and tell us that we cannot gather to worship. And you're right, pastors all over the country, including my own pastor, Mark Dever at Capitol Hill Baptist Church, we were vindicated ultimately when a court heard the case.
Now, isn't there some concern that if we take this sphere sovereignty approach and say, well, when the government acts outside of its duly delegated sphere, we are not obligated to obey? Isn't there some concern that we then become a law unto ourselves and that we decide, oh, well, that's not their proper authority, therefore I can ignore that law. That's not their proper authority, now I can ignore that law as well. Does that create a landscape where we're all inventing the laws and deciding what we want to obey or not ourselves?
Well, it certainly could, Joseph, and I think that's why it's so important for Christians to be having these conversations, to seek the wisdom of church leaders. None of us should be kind of lone rangers doing our own thing. I think that's why having the conversations that you and I are having right now is important, because these are issues that Scripture speaks to directly, or there's principles that we can apply to it. And so I think having these conversations in community is really important, or else we do, descend into anarchy, which is not at all what we want to do, or what I think is the vision that Scripture gives us when it talks about the size and scope of government.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's part of the reason why the local church is important. And we do have to approach the question in humility, not in I'm going to find a way to get what I want, but I want to make sure that I'm doing the right thing, because there really is a tension here, because I think there's a really good, sincere argument to be made that, hey, that's what the law says. The Bible doesn't tell me not to. I need to submit to that in humility. But I also can make the argument, and I have made the argument, that one way to love your neighbor is to make sure that your neighbor's grandkids don't get born into a tyrannical government, and that we have to be stewards of the freedom that we have and make sure that we don't surrender it just because it's hard. Now, finally, we got about a minute left to tackle this question. Religious exemptions, talked about all the time. Is the fact that I don't like something grounds for me claiming a religious exemption?
It's not, Joseph, and I think that's really important to, a religious exemption has to be able to point to a serious tenet of your religious belief. However, there are serious objections that people have that I think can be considered conscience objections. A conscience objection is similar to religious exemption, that it goes to the core of who you are. And if your conscience tells you that something is morally wrong, morally impermissible, I think you should be afforded a conscience objection, because I don't think anybody in this country should be forced to do something that they, at the core of who they are, believe it's inappropriate or immoral. I think if we go down that direction, that's pretty troubling for all Americans.
And that's the challenge we're all facing right now. And kind of this, is it a religious exemption? I just don't want to, but that doesn't necessarily mean that God's going to be bothered and that I have a biblical grounds not to do it. And again, humility in all things. David Closson, really appreciate your time and your wisdom once again.
Thank you, Joseph.